Shop the Sherwin-Williams Labor Day sale and get 35% off paints and stains August 22nd through September 4th. With prices starting at $31.84, it's the perfect time to transform your space with color. Whether you're looking to revamp your interior or exterior, we have you covered with bold hues, soothing neutrals, and everything in between. Visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store or shop the sale online. Delivery available on qualifying orders. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's a pillar of Canadian postal services. Yet somehow the country's very own Crown Mail courier, Canada Post, has failed to secure profits for the better part of the last decade. The company has been in an almost 2-year back and forth with the union that represents its 55,000 employees. The crux of their fallout, one that Canadians felt at a time that couldn't have been worse. Their month-long strike in the peak of the 2024 holiday season. That brought mail service to a complete halt across the country, reportedly racking up a receipt of more than $1.5 billion. That was until the workers were federally ordered back to work. But besides the current situation at the bargaining table, the financial woes of Canada Post go beyond the fallout of job action, with many wondering just how long the Postal Service can keep the lights on amid consistent record losses and a competitive market that the Crown Company just can't seem to catch up to. I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Ian Lee, Associate Professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University, to discuss how deep of a hole Canada Post has dug itself into and how, if possible, they can bring themselves out of it. Ian, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Maria.
So it's been 21 months of negotiations between Canada Post and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. To kind of bring us up to date, just less than a year ago, it's 55,000 members who went on strike, which resulted in a complete paralysis of mail delivery across the country. That ended with the two sides being ordered back to work. And more than 9 months later, here we are now, still no deal, and still lots of room between the two sides at the bargaining table. Ian, what do you make of how negotiations have taken shape so far?
Well, they failed. I mean, there's just no way to sugarcoat it and pretend that it has been, a rip-roaring success or even a modest success. There's a complete failure. That's why they were ordered back to work. That's why the mediator was appointed. And that's why they're still negotiating, because they're, and I'm not blaming either side. I mean, their two positions are so far apart. You could drive, if I can use colloquial language, you could drive the American army, the Russian army, and the Chinese army between the gap that exists between the two companies. Canada Post says they've got to restructure to survive. I think it's even more extreme than that, based on I did a PhD thesis, 850 pages in 1989, and I did 2 subsequent follow-up reports. In 2015, is the check still in the mail? And then last year, the tipping point has arrived. I do want to point something out, Maria, before we go forward, because I get all kinds of emails saying, well, this is your opinion. I didn't interview anybody for any of these reports. They were based 100% on the audited annual reports tabled in the Parliament of Canada, where the data has been tabled year after year after year from the auditors. The losses, the decline in volumes of letters, decline in parcels. These are not my opinions. I have opinions about what they need to do to turn it around, but the facts are not opinions. And right now, I think a lot of the problem is that the two sides don't even agree about the facts. There's and I would argue they're both, they're not there. Canada Post thinks that they just have to do a few little tweaks, bring in some part-time workers on the weekend, and hey, everything is going to be happy days are here again. Canada Post is insolvent. Canada Post is bankrupt, except that because it's owned by the 100% by the government of Canada, which means the taxpayers of Canada, it will not be closed down until the government decides to close it down. But that's where they are right now. There's no common ground because CUPW completely rejects the restructuring, and Canada Post is imposing, I will call them baby steps, when what is needed is radical surgery. The patient is in the fourth stage, nearing death, and they need radical surgery. Canada Post, you don't hear that language from. They say, well, we need to do a few little tweaks on the weekend and everything's going to be okay. It's not.
Radical surgery. Let's get to that. Canada Post's latest update in their negotiations just last week includes them basically saying to the union, look, please reconsider because we actually just can't meet what you want. What about the union's demands are so undeliverable for Canada Post?
Well, that tells me, and they are. They're asked, and I'm not quibbling over the fact they want 9% or 4% or 6%. That's not the issue. The underlying model of Canada Post is unsustainable. Canada Post is dying before our eyes. And people say that's very radical and that's very controversial. No, it's not. Let me rephrase that. How many people listening right now or watching write letters, hundreds, thousands of letters every year to their mother and father, or their grandmother or grandfather, or their brother or sister? Well, don't be ridiculous. Nobody writes letters anymore. We all use this. Everybody knows what this looks like. I don't even have to explain what this little black thing is. Everybody in this country seeing this knows what this is. We are using this and not the post office. That is the problem facing Canada Post. It's because letters are collapsing and parcels, which should be soaring because e-commerce is soaring, this is Stats Canada data, is not, because Canada Post is not competitive with the private couriers in Canada delivering parcels. And one more quick point, Maria, just to make a very important distinction that many people don't seem to realize. Canada Post has a legal monopoly granted by Parliament over letters. But I just said letters are collapsing. 65% have gone. 2/3 of the letters written compared to 2006 are just disappeared. But in parcels, Canada Post does not have a monopoly from the Parliament of Canada. So they are facing brutal, savage competition from all the private courier companies. So their core market of letters is collapsing because people don't write letters anymore. They use this little thing. And in parcels, they're not competitive and they're not reliable to many users. So the users are deserting them and going to the private companies.
Those private companies, FedEx, UPS, DHL, they continue to dominate the mail delivery
Yes.
industry. You kind of said they don't compete. Canada Post doesn't compete with them. They can't compete with them. Where do you think Canada Post service ranks among those others?
In parcels?
Sure.
Well, clearly the data, and again, I'm as I'm sure you're realizing talking to me, I'm purely evidence-based. So I just look at the numbers. To me, the numbers, as I say to my students, the truth is in the numbers. The truth is not what the CEO says. I tell any company, I just don't trust CEOs or CFOs. I don't trust union presidents. I don't trust politicians. I look at data, hard data, not opinion data. I'm not talking polling data, much as I do respect polling data. I'm talking audited annual reports. I'm talking customer market share. The private courier companies, their market share is soaring, going up. What is the market saying? And what is the market? The market is the users that use use parcels. They're all saying, we don't find the service acceptable anymore. That's why we have abandoned it. They lost 35% market share in 1 month. And this is on top of what they lost in the last 4 years when they went from 60% market share in Canada at the beginning of COVID down, they dropped to 30%, and that number is down, way down since then. So they're collapsing, their market share is collapsing in the one market that will save them, and the other market is collapsing because people don't write letters.
Right. I want to get into the numbers, the losses that Canada Post has been reporting. Reportedly, they haven't made any profit since 2017.
Correct.
And since then, it's lost a whopping $3 billion. And because of that, there's been loud calls, especially from people like you, to make these sweeping changes, as you call it, radical surgery. What kind of radical surgery is in store for Canada Post if they want to keep the lights on?
Right. And I thank you for this question, because a lot of people write me and say, you just want to kill Canada Post and get rid of it. I've never said any such thing. I do not support the privatization of Canada Post, because not for ideological reasons or philosophical reasons or partisan reasons. It's because that's not the issue. The issue is not who owns the corporation, whether it's private sector or public sector. That will not make people get rid of this and start writing letters. Anyone who thinks that because you privatize the post office, millions of Canadians are going to say, okay, that's it. Everybody back to file cabinets, back to paper bills, back to letters to mom and dad, and we'll save the post office. That's delusional. So it doesn't matter who owns the post office. So what I've argued is letter mail is vanishing before our eyes because you young people just don't write letters at all. The only people keeping any letters going in the post office are elderly people. I've got the data. Okay, so these are people over 65. And I want to say this very gently and delicately, but older people pass away. You get to a certain point in your life and you die. So the people using the post office are dying. And there's less and less letters written every year. Young people don't write letters whatsoever. Okay, so that market, we've got to accept that and say, end home delivery immediately. That'll save almost $1 billion. That's the numbers from Canada Post, by the way. Home delivery to the 25% of Canadians who get home delivery. By the way, I'm one of them. I should not be getting it to my house, to my door. I don't mean to community mailboxes. Number 2, there is no justification for the thousands and thousands of post office workers marching up and down the streets of Canada to almost 18 million homes, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, pretending to deliver mail that millions and millions of Canadians do not write. So we've got to end 5-day-a-week delivery. We can quibble, should it be 1 day a week, 2 days a week, but it's not going to be 5 days a week. The third radical surgery. The over 30,500 post offices that are corporate owned as opposed to franchise. There's already large numbers of postal franchises in Shoppers Drug Mart, Loblaws, Sobeys, etc., etc. I've argued that every last one of them should be franchised. Not privatized, not sold off, not closed, franchised. And people write me and say, well, why on earth would they want to have such a losing proposition? Because Loblaws wants it as a traffic builder. So does Shoppers. They want you to be forced to go into that store to pick up your passport, and then hopefully you'll buy all the other stuff, and they sell a huge amount of stuff at Shoppers. You walk in and you're overwhelmed by perfumes and cosmetics and everything else, and that's before you even get into the main part of the store. So they want these, and they have lobbied the government privately. The retailers saying, please give us franchises. And that would save another $1.5 billion a year. But let's be very clear, Maria, what I've just said. You get rid of home delivery, and you get rid of 5-day-a-week delivery, and you get rid of and you franchise all the post offices that are still owned by the Canada Post. You're talking downsizing the post office by 40,000 people. Because you don't need those people anymore to deliver. If you don't deliver 5 days a week, you don't need an army of people marching up and down the streets of Canada. If you don't take it to the door, you have massive savings of labor. And the post office is almost all labor. It's heavily 75% labor cost is their annual cost of doing business. About 3/4 is wages, labor. If you do that radical surgery, you're going to get rid of thousands and thousands of people. Now, some people say, well, that's terrible, that's horrible, that's awful. It would be about the same size as the downsizing by Prime Minister Chrétien and Paul Martin in 1995, and when we downsized the government of Canada. But more to the point, if we don't do that, people say, well, let's just keep it going. Well, then what we're going to do is subsidize the post office. Last year, we gave them $1 billion in January, but that's not the end. That's the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. They'll be back. Look, they just announced a $500 million loss, and that's only halfway through the year. At the end of the year, the losses could be $1.5 billion. And next year it'll get larger, not smaller, because the revenues and the letters written are declining year by year. Same with the parcels. So in other words, if the revenues and the parcels and the letters are going down year by year, the loss, and you're not getting rid of any headcount, then your losses are going to go up year by year. Canada Post, not me, in the annual report last year stated that the revenue structure, the business model of Canada Post will not support that many people on the payroll. So, they've said it's unsustainable, and so they've got to restructure to recognize, to address that reality.
Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. That's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
Well, Ian, if the writing is on the wall as to what exactly Canada Post needs to do to save themselves, and a big part of that is phasing out that daily door-to-door mail delivery service and implementing more of those community mailboxes, where do you think this hesitation comes from Canada Post to do that?
I think, and I'm not pointing the finger at any one of them, the CUPW, Canada Post Management, and the Government of Canada do not want to acknowledge the fact that there's a massive downsizing required because it's ugly. Everybody understands it. Who wants to go out and say, I'm going to lay off 30, 40,000 people? It's political. And I understand that. I do. I'm not sitting here celebrating it. But, that's just the reality of technological change. Blockbuster Video, at the time it went under, employed, paradoxically, or ironically, I should say, almost the same number of people as Canada Post, 65,000. Yet they all got laid off. Why didn't we keep Blockbuster Video going after social streaming came along, technological streaming? Well, because it was a private company and because the cost would have been staggering. And most importantly, the demand wasn't there. People no longer wanted to go to a video store to rent a video. People no longer want to use the post office by and large, with some exceptions we can talk about, rural and those areas that don't get parcel delivery. But the point that I'm getting at is this is not going to return around. We're not going to go back to writing letters, and there's no evidence that they can recover in parcels. They're losing these customers permanently to the privates. So they've got to do a very large downsizing. The Government of Canada does not want to confront that and accept that and acknowledge it. Neither does CUPW, neither does Canada Post Management.
You mentioned that the rural communities and how vital mail delivery service is to them, and that's one thing that does set Canada Post apart. How vital is that? How do you see their restructuring or their radical surgery, as you say? Where does northern and rural community mail delivery service fit into this radical change that you think?
Well, this is where, again, people write me letters all the time and say, you're just dismissing the people in the rural and you're just dismissing people in, northern Saskatchewan and so forth. No, I'm not. I've actually said repeatedly that there is a demand for the post office, but it's not in the big cities where 80% of Canadians live, according to StatsCan. It's not in the Torontos and the Calgarys and the Vancouvers and the Montreals by and large. Yes, there's a handful of people, but in aggregate terms, it's very small. But I grew up in rural Eastern Ontario, obviously a long time ago. And my point is that is where the need is. Northern Ontario, rural Quebec, rural Maritimes, rural British Columbia, rural prairies. And it's less than 20% of the population, 10 to 15% because of the way we count who's rural and urban. Canada Post has been making that argument. A lot of so-called rural post offices are no longer rural. They've become suburbs of cities. I won't get into that quibble. I figure it's about somewhere around 10% of people who are truly in the rural that do not have private parcel delivery. So we're going to have to create a much smaller post office that will continue to service the parcel needs. Letters are going to vanish inside 10 years. Within 10 years, I will be and I don't think it's a bold prediction at all. It's just a straight extrapolation of trends. Within 10 years, there will be no letters left. It'll be just a little tail of letters, statistical tail. Right now we went from 5.5 billion to 2 billion. Within 10 years, most of those 2 billion letters being written today will vanish. So we're talking about parcels. And so what we do need is a post office that will be basically servicing the rural and remote communities of Canada.
I think a lot of people are curious to know, at this point, a deal hasn't been reached. Last year's strike was absolutely paralyzing to the entire country. What do you think are the odds of another strike coming? Do you think more job action is on the horizon?
It could be, but it would probably be an illegal strike. They may be emboldened by what the Air Canada flight attendants did. I say an illegal strike because the government's already sent them back to work. I did a paper about 15 years ago called Striking Out, and long story short, very quickly, I found that from 1950 to 2015, the government legislated striking workers back to work 36 times. That's roughly one every year and a half. And what was even more astonishing, almost all of them but two, 34 of 36, were in transportation and communications. And since then, the government's found this 107 section of the Act, and they've sent them back to work with an administrative order, Section 107. So that's a distinction without a difference. Whether you use Parliament to send them back to work or you use Section 107, you're still breaking the strike and sending them back to work. So the government has shown that in transportation, it's so crucial to the country, they are going to do it. And people can argue, no, they're not. Well, they did. They did it now 44 times from 1950, not 1867, from after the Second World War to the present. And by the way, it's accelerating. So the number isn't going down. The number of sending workers back to work to end strikes is going up, not down. So the trend is clear. The government's going to do it because of the massive disruption to the economy. So I think you will see the government, we're probably approaching some kind of a crisis. I mean a crisis where the union says, no, we're not going back to work, and the government says, we are in charge of the country. Shades of Margaret Thatcher and the coal miners way back in 1990, I believe it was 1991, or Ronald Reagan with the air traffic controllers in 1984, where the union defied the government, and the British government and then the American government, and both of them legislated them back to work. And when they didn't refuse to obey the back to work legislation, they bankrupted the union by imposing massive fines on them and then seizing all of their assets. So whether a Canadian government will go down that road because it was so draconian and so ugly, I don't know. But the current situation is not sustainable unless people believe that the government should just shell out $1 billion, then maybe $2 billion, then maybe $3 billion every year to continue a post office that no longer is being used by the vast majority of Canadians.
Ian, I want to ask you, if Canada Post were to keep conducting their day-to-day operations as they are now, would they be able to keep the lights on over the next 5 years?
As now, without any change?
Yeah.
Only with government bailouts. I mean, these bailouts, this is why I find it's almost surreal listening to them. And I mean both the management and CUPW, they're saying, well, we got to get back to negotiations and find a deal. Like they're talking as if everything's just fine. You know, they're like Willie Coyote, who's run over top of the cliff. The cliff is now, there's a 5,000 drop down to the ground, but they still think they're on ground. And they're saying, oh yeah, we're going to sit here and have a nice little conversation about a new collective agreement. The company is insolvent. It is broke. The losses are going to get bigger and bigger. So the only question is, will Prime Minister Carney and the government be willing to say, we're going to give an open-ended check and subsidize whatever losses come down the pipes each year, and we'll just keep on paying the bills? At a time when the deficit's already going through the roof, A, and B, they desperately need money for a whole bunch of other things, such as helping out businesses hurt by Trump's tariffs, and helping, in reinvesting in more money in defense spending and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of demands on the government's plate. They're talking about cutting the rest of the public service by 15% this year alone, probably to be announced in the budget this fall. Can they really sustain and keep paying out $1 billion, maybe $2 billion a year to a organization that the vast majority of Canadians no longer uses? And so politically, the government of Canada is going to have to bite the bullet. I believe it's going to require a legislative solution where they introduce a bill in Parliament that imposes restructuring, because neither Canada Post nor CUPW are going to agree to the radical surgery that is needed to transform Canada Post.
Well, Ian, I guess we're going to have to see in the next 5 years what exactly the Carney government does about it. Ian Lee, Associate Professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Maria. Thank you.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.